Hello to our viewers in the United States, and good evening to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. Over the past 2 weeks, we've had a chance to watch the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, for the first time, they were held as virtual events with highlights during 2 hours of primetime television each day. On a Friday evening in Germany, I'm delighted to welcome 4 Bundestag members who have been following the conventions. After serving as a member of the European Parliament for 4 years, Dr. Franziska Brantner was elected to the Bundestag in 2013 and represents the constituency of Heidelberg. She is her party's spokesperson for European policy and the parliamentary whip of the parliamentary group of Bündnis 90 Die Grünen, or the Greens. She's a member of the Committee on the Affairs of the European Union and a deputy member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Franziska, herzlich willkommen.
It's my pleasure.
Also from Baden-Württemberg is Dr. Nils Schmid. He has been a member of the Bundestag for the Social Democratic Party since September of 2017. He serves as a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Since 2018, he has been the spokesperson on foreign affairs for the SPD parliamentary group. From 1997 to 2017, Nils Schmid was a member of the Baden-Württemberg State Parliament, and during that time, from 2011 to 2016, he served as the state's Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs and as Deputy Minister President of Baden-Württemberg. I'm glad you can join us. And let me welcome back our 2 other speakers. Thomas Erndl, who will be joining us in just a few minutes, has been a member of the Christian Social Union, or CSU, since 1991 and involved in local politics in Lower Bavaria since 1993. Since 2017, he has been a member of the Bundestag. He sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee and heads the subcommittee on foreign, cultural, and educational policy. And last but not least is Alexander Kulitz. He's also a member of the Bundestag. He represents Baden-Württemberg and represents the Free Democratic Party, or FDP. He serves as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as a deputy member of the Subcommittee on Foreign, Cultural, and Educational Policy, the Committee on Economic and Energy Affairs, and the Committee on Labor and Social Affairs. Alex, it's good to see you again.
Well, thanks for having me, and good day to the States.
Last week, I had the opportunity to talk with both Thomas Erndl and Alexander Kulitz about the Democratic National Convention. Today, we're going to be talking about the Republican Convention. But before we dive in, I'd like to ask Franziska Brantner and Nils Schmid about the DNC. In broad brushstrokes, what stood out to you about the Democratic Convention? Let's start with you, Franziska.
What stood out to me was the unity of the party, because the Democratic Party has, at least from our perspective, been rather divided over the last couple of years in internal fights over the direction to take. And it was interesting to see that there was a broad rallying behind the presidential nominee and the nominee for vice president. And it was also a very diverse and broad convention, which respected the Corona social distancing rules, which I thought was quite impressive because it's not easy to organize such big events respecting the rules. But yeah, the unity of the party, which I think can be a key asset for the next coming weeks and months, was really striking me.
Thank you. And what about you, Niels? What stood out to you about the Democratic Convention?
Well, I agree with Franziska that it was a show of unity, which is promising for November. I also guess that Obama's speech was quite extraordinary, because for a former president to bring about such a, let's say, partisan and quite brutal speech is very uncommon, but it shows the sense of urgency prevailing among Democrats in the US. I must say that a real convention would have had more effect, not only on me, but most probably also on American citizens. So it seemed more as a series of Zoom shows during the last week. I would have loved to attend the convention. Actually, there was a delegation from the Social Democratic Party prepared to fly over.
I was at the last one, yes, at Obama.
Yeah. So, well, but the most important lesson to draw from the Democratic Convention was its unity indeed, yeah.
So obviously the experience was very different because of COVID-19, and I agree with you, Nils. It seemed like a massive Zoom webinar made for television, and so it was obviously a little different from what one would have anticipated. And in some senses, the Republican convention was a little bit different. But let me ask the two of you before bringing Thomas and Alexander into the conversation. As you watched the Republican convention this week, what were you paying close attention to? Franziska,
well,
would you like or Nils?
Sorry, go ahead, Franziska.
I paid close attention to what are going to be the main attacks on Biden and how they're going to deal with the corona crisis. And I thought it was interesting to see how they tried to retell the story on corona and to make it sort of, it's the past. And that they really, were focusing on one topic, law and order, which they have been doing over the last couple of weeks already. So I think that was, for me, I was really trying to see what's going to be the angle of attack and how they're going to deal with the terrible crisis situation on corona.
And was there anything that surprised you about what you saw?
No, not really in terms of Trump or how terrible it is and how many lies there are. I'm like, this is not surprising us anymore. But I was sometimes shocked that some of the next generation or next aspiration of next presidential nominees, Cotton, etc., were even more terrifying. So that sort of surprised me. I had hoped there might be some room for some more nuanced speeches, but there really wasn't a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. And Nils, what were you looking out for?
Well, most striking to me was not the substance, but rather the form of the virtual convention the Republicans managed to organize. Although I was appalled by the content of the speeches and the habit of lying, which has more or less been accepted within the Republican Party, I must admit that the high level of professionalism in organizing this event, albeit under breach of law, when it comes to using the real White House, when it comes to using the State Department's facilities in Jerusalem and all this stuff. I must say, in terms of performance, of appearance, the Republican convention seems much more effective to me, whereas the Democratic convention appears more traditional in a way. So I believe that the Republicans, from their point of view, did a really good job in holding such an event, I must say.
Let me maybe push you on that, and I recognize that this might be a little difficult for all of you to answer, given that you were watching in the middle of the night or the day after. But it seemed to me as if the Democrats in their convention had tried to sort of organize speeches in a way that they would complement each other in terms of one after the other. The Republican speeches did not seem to be as coordinated. I mean, Nils, to your point that it might have seemed a little bit more professional, it seemed as if there were a lot of different themes that didn't necessarily fall into place in terms of a structure for each of the convention days? Any thoughts on that?
Well, okay, maybe this was just the point they wanted to reach. So they showed up a sort of diversity.
So I think we're losing you a little bit, Nils.
Views of people. Although it was very much staged. Okay, well.
Franziska, and since we've lost Nils for a moment, any thoughts on that?
I thought that most of the speeches during the Republican had the underlying theme of law and order, and in some way or not another, they were portraying the same fears they were trying to, to galvanize. So I thought it was rather coherent, but I don't know. I didn't see all of them, and but I have rather had the impression they focused quite well on one topic. They all minimized Corona. That was quite coherent, and they all tried to retell the Corona story, which I thought was quite impressive. I'm like, he is the president, and the death toll is quite high, and to be able to master that story. And I agree, like, it was quite impressive with Jerusalem, etc. But I was appalled by not keeping up the social distancing rules. I don't know how that impacts on Americans who watch it, but for me, I was like, oh my God, they're not respecting the rules. And I don't know, I thought that this was, at least for me, was quite shocking to see.
It was, I mean, I think for me, watching it with several other Americans at the same time, both when Vice President Mike Pence spoke, but then particularly last night when President Trump spoke, to see so many people so close together, not wearing masks, did come as a bit of a surprise. And yet, I think both of you, Franziska and Nils, talking about rewriting the COVID story in a very different way from the way that we saw it presented last week, was certainly one of the takeaways that a lot of people are taking from this convention. Let me bring Thomas and Alexander into the conversation. We've talked about a couple of the themes that were conveyed in the Republican convention. Were there other issues that came up that you found particularly interesting, or any of the speeches that stood out for either of you?
I mean, maybe just adding to the Corona topic, I think maybe it was one learning compared to the Democratic convention, that you need more live audience in order to transport more emotions. So as Nils mentioned, the show was a little bit better since there were more people in watching live basically, and having a bigger audience. But on the other hand, it's also a political position and signal not taking Corona serious when you put 2,000 people together next to each other without any distance or mask. So that's I wanted to add. I mean, what somehow a surprise in the beginning, I thought that it might not be serious, but when you see a list of key speakers, 12 people on this photo graphic, and then 6 out of the 12 were Trump family. This is an interesting observation that a lot of maybe senior GOP members or former leaders, whatever, were not participating or were not providing themselves as a speaker. So this is an interesting observation as well, which maybe worth to mention. What stood out for me was maybe the speech of Melania Trump, as she gave a speech which I would expect from a first lady. So this was maybe not that in line with all the others bashing the Democrats, but more on a senior way of speaking as a first lady, being empathetic and on the emotions as you would expect it.
And I think she was the one that really stood out because of the empathy with regard to COVID-19 and sort of addressing some of the real hardship and challenge more so than some of the others did. That's for sure. Alex, what about you? What stood out to you?
Well, comparing the two, I think that looking at the Democratic Convention, I had the impression it was more of their aim to also embrace all of the Americans, not to put the division that exists in anyhow between the, not to focus too much on it. Whereas the Republicans, obviously, they had a very hard tackle on Joe Biden and his ideas. Always putting up front also the risk of what happens if a socialist America and kind of these communist socialist ideas of the left wing radicals, etc. So they were drawing a picture that was way more, I believe, pushing on why you should definitely not vote for the Democrats. But when you were asking about probably the theme or the scheme that was also put up by the now by the Republican convention, I think besides the law and order, which was definitely one of the topics, what kind of surprised me a little bit, or it didn't really surprise me, but I think another focus was really much set on the question of Black people and minorities, putting out once again, or himself praising him being the president who did the most for the Black people. And the speech that was probably most outstanding, or a bit outstanding to me, looking at the Republican Congress, was Senator Tim Scott, being a Black senator and also moving forward for the Republican Party and praising Donald Trump in a way that I wouldn't expect really to I'm not quite sure whether this was an address to Black people or whether it was rather just praising Donald Trump's actions to convey even more white voters on why he's not a racist, why he should be elected, why he is the right guy. And that was kind of something that I didn't expect it to be to happen this way. Because looking at the Democratic Convention once again, I think it was a very clever move to also have senior Republican people speaking up at the Democratic Convention, whereas at the Republican Convention, to me, it struck that they really put up a topic I wouldn't expect at a Republican convention that way.
So you've drawn this out a little bit, and it's come up a little bit before, this notion of diversity and the role that diversity played at the Democratic Convention and the degree to which it played a role at the Republican Convention. Last week when we were talking about the Democratic Convention really being a convention of unity, and that's something, Franziska, that you brought up as well just now. Did you get a sense of party unity within the Republican Party after watching the convention the last few days? And did you get a sense of true diversity? I mean, granted, these are two very different questions, but I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about both party unity and about diversity. Franziska, you're smiling. That makes me think that you might have a response.
No, but Thomas already said it. I was surprised who we did not see more than who we saw on the scene. So there was no Bush there, many of the very senior members and politicians of the Republican Party were not there, or at least not publicly visible, were not intervening. And I thought that this was quite interesting. But Thomas already said it. So I thought it was quite evident that you have many of the former establishment in the Republican Party who don't feel comfortable with Trump.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on the issue?
I agree with Thomas and Franziska. It's Trump's Republican Party. It's not the GOP we are used to know and we are used to cooperate with. And so more outstanding than those who attended are those who did not attend, former presidents, former government members, lots of senators. So this shows that the Republican Party has quite narrowed its profile, political profile, and also its political platform. And this is of great concern to us in Europe.
And also, because you talked, your second part was about party unity. I think, you know, those former leaders not being present doesn't mean that the party isn't united. The current one, it just shows to what extent Trump has managed to take over the Republican Party, which is quite a piece of work.
Thomas and Alex, anything to add to that?
Well, I sometimes have the feeling that within the Republican Party itself, that's also when we looked at the people speaking up at the Democratic Convention a little bit. Many people, I believe, that are actually Republican voters or even party members are not at all happy with Donald Trump being the leader at the moment. But it's more the fear of the idea of the socialist United States or socialist America that really keeps those people aligned following Donald Trump. And even if you talk to friends that I know that are members of the Republican Party and actually are, well, it strikes that talking about Trump, sometimes they accept Trump as he is, with all these alternative facts and things that he puts out, etc., just because the fear of a socialist America is too big for them. So they will rather accept Trump with all his, at least in their views, with all his issues, rather than taking into account of the idea of having a democratic leadership once again, which I think is quite striking. But I think that's one of the big differences between American politics and European politics. We have many voters that just switch in between different kind of parties once in a while, looking at the ideas, whereas in America, this is very difficult and very tough.
So unfortunately, we just lost Nils, and I wanted to pose a viewer question that touches on something that Nils was just talking about. One of our viewers writes, after watching the Republican convention, are any of you worried? And if so, what worries you the most about the next 4 years of a Trump administration and what it would mean for Germany?
Well, I'm not worried. I'm frightened after what I saw this morning, especially one thing, but I think that's the same with Biden or with Trump, this decoupling idea that is very much, that was also in Trump's speech very prominently, putting back that we have to get all the jobs back to America. We have to really decouple and look at the Chinese. So if you look at the foreign policy aspects that he put in his speech, I think this is rather frightening, because knowing that we have these global value chains and we more or less have dependencies on each other due to these value chains internationally, destroying them, and this seems to be one of the major goals in the upcoming 4 years for Donald Trump. Destroying these global value chains also means destroying dependencies on each other. But if we destroy the dependencies that we have with each other, it makes it much easier to attack each other in whatever sense. Might it be a trade war? Might it even be a military conflict? So I'm quite frightened that this is a goal. I think we rather need more multilateral international engagement rather than drawing back and decoupling. And this was, to me, it's very worrying, yes.
And I think this is most disappointing when considering the Republican Party, that in my view, it was always a party being for free trade and competition, and now basically you have to say that Trump Republicans were changing this position, and so you have maybe the old Republicans which are hiding a little bit and being pragmatic. We have to hope that in 4 years, at least in 4 years, they show up again. But this is for me the most disappointing in the overall situation. And maybe this division, Trump Republicans and the others, are also shown by this Lincoln project. I don't know how this is seen in the US, at least in Europe it resonates quite a lot, and it's interesting to see that there are Republicans actively promoting voting for Biden.
It certainly resonates with some. Franziska, yes.
Oh, I think what scares me is the idea of having Trump as a president in the next 4 years, knowing that there will be very difficult economic times worldwide, that we will have recessions, that it will, be a slow return to for an economic recovery, and to have in these times an American president who destroys every multilateral tie that the United States have, that's for me, that's the scary part. It was already scary during COVID, the beginning, to have Trump there and not somebody like Obama, not calling immediately the G20, developing a joint approach to how we handle internationally the crisis, but to have somebody who is trying rather to take the stocks of vaccinations and etc. So I think for me that's worrisome, because there will be difficult economic times for the US, for us, for the entire world. And in such times, to have Trump as a president, I find it's quite a worrying perspective. And then, on climate, very worrisome. On foreign affairs in general, very worrisome. And I think, for us as Europeans, we just have to realize that we are bound to act on our own behalf, be it on the corona crisis, on the economic crisis. And I'm glad that we will hopefully have a big recovery package, a European one, because nobody else will do it for us, So I think this will have to be our German answer to that, has to take over more responsibility when it comes to stabilizing Europe and our neighborhood.
So let's stick with foreign policy for just a minute. And Nils, I'd like to draw you out on this. You touched on Secretary of State Pompeo, who was speaking from Jerusalem on Tuesday evening. On Wednesday, Rick Grenell, the former US ambassador in Berlin, made the case for Trump's foreign policy, claiming that it had been a grand success.
He charmed Merkel. I don't know where he got that from. I was laughing like hell.
I think that was a moment where a lot of people who follow the German-American relationship very closely said it didn't really fit with what they've seen presented in public for certain. And there's also been some circulation of the Chancellor responding to that today at a press conference. But I think the view in many capitals of America's longstanding allies is not nearly as positive as the view that was presented by the Secretary of State or by Rick Grenell. And on many levels, people feel that the Trump administration has isolated and irritated many actors on the world stage. And I guess the question that I would have for you, Nils, and then others please weigh in, is what did you think of the presentation of Trump's foreign policy at the convention?
I found it ridiculous. Well, it depends who's your audience and who are your friends in the world. If dictators are your friends in the world, it was a big success. But if you want to stick to your traditional allies, Trump's foreign policy was a great failure. And what really saddens me most is the fact that the Trump administration is the first post-war administration in Washington that actively obstructs European integration, works against the European Union, and even considers the European Union more or less as an adversary. And this is a fundamental shift in US foreign policy. We were used to have the US on our side. We were used to have the US as a staunch supporter for European integration. And all the fuss about NATO's 2% goal, about Germany and Europe taking more responsibility, only works in a cooperative form with the US. What Trump is doing is pushing Europe away from the US. And for many Germans who are fond of the transatlantic bond, this is a disaster. And we know that in the business community, in Congress, in civil society, in academia, There are so many friends of Europe, friends of Germany in the US, but what Trump conveys is the picture, the image, which is crucial to the perception of the US in the European and in German societies. And so it's really has a devastating effect on America's image in Germany. And for me, Trump is a lost cause. So you at the beginning, we hope that there would be some counselors, some ministers who would sort of hatch it and try to rein in Trump and his instincts. But we've seen over the last 4 years that we cannot count on anybody in the White House and at least in the cabinet of the United States. And so 4 more years of Trump would just mean 4 more lost years for the transatlantic partnership, and would have tremendous consequences on how Germans and Europeans perceive the US. Although, as I want to repeat it, there are so many supporters of very close ties between the US and Europe. And this has to be understood by our American friends, that it's about the president. It's not about the Congress. It's not about think tankers. It's the president who really dominates the perception of the US in Germany and in Europe. And this makes me very sad.
So Nils, we've had a hard time hearing you, but I think it's fair to say that you feel that another 4 years of the Trump administration would be a lost cause and would make the transatlantic relationship all the more difficult. That there are areas where we have common interests, of course. Others of you who have been listening in, any thoughts on the way in which foreign policy was addressed or presented at the convention? Well, Thomas, let me ask you a specific question, because you have a background in the military, and we do have a viewer question, which is the following. If Trump is reelected, it's very possible that the United States will withdraw from NATO. How would Germany and the rest of Europe deal with such a situation?
I mean, not sure if it's really then very possible that the US would withdraw. I think, as it was mentioned already, we will have a further hard time on all these discussion points or issues. And what's really annoying is, for instance, the 2% discussion. I mean, we of course need to do more, we need to invest more, but we need to discuss this in the right way, right? We do not owe the NATO any money. We have an agreement that we will spend 2% by 2024. Now we are in 2020, so we did not miss any of the agreements by now, and I think we need to put the discussion right and put the correct facts on the table. I mean, we were, at least until maybe 3 months ago, before the troops reduction was announced, we were always saying, well, Trump was saying this and was basically criticizing NATO and the partners and allies on one hand, but on the other hand, we have as many troops compared to whatever a few years ago. We have basically let's say a certain high in troops in Europe and in Germany. So what he was saying and what the US was doing was somehow not in line. And then basically the reduction was announced, and I mean it's up to the US how many troops they would have in Europe and in Germany. But I think as an ally, as a partner, you need to expect to have an open discussion and an open communication and a partnership on eye level, and not the way as it is handled now. And I think this is the biggest fear and threat we'll have by 4 more years of President Trump. Whether, I mean, at the end it would really happen and they would withdraw from NATO, at the end we have anyway the challenge of having a sort of discoupling as well and having Europe being more on our own feet, and of course it would make clear to anybody also in Europe and in Germany that we need to invest more in our security and at the end in our military.
Maybe I can add on this question, Steve.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, independent of Trump, we as Europeans have to create our own capacities. The goal, I think, is not to become independent of the US. Like that would, you know, take resources and still, I don't think we would enter into a war against each other. So I think that even under Trump, I think hopefully is far out. But I think we have to shift in Europe the debate on the 2%, because the 2% is a national goal. And by the way, we might well reach this because of the economic recession, which is absurd, because of course it's a percentage. I think, you know, what we need is to define as Europeans what kind of capabilities we need for what kind of scenarios, and then have them produce them together. And that doesn't make sense to do it according to 2% national lines, because then we might end up with the same scenario as we have it today, that actually we as Europeans, you know, spend a lot on the military, but we don't create enough synergies to create the capabilities we need. So I think we as Europeans have to get out of this 2% mantra and get into what capabilities do we need for what kind of scenario, and then do get them. I'm agreeing we're not a militarist force, but I see the need that we need to define our own capabilities and get them and be ready to intervene as Europeans in the scenarios, especially in our neighborhood. But it won't be possible if we just fixate on the 2% nationally. Like Greece is the only country in Europe that really keeps it, because they have such high burdens of their veterans, etc. So it doesn't make any sense in that respect to keep to that figure. And I hope that whoever will be a next American president, that we can shift the debate to capabilities away from percentages.
If I can comment or maybe add something, I agree with Franziska that we need to further discuss on the capabilities, and the 2% is not a very clever way of setting the goal, but it's at the end a symbol for just what you said, that we need to be more on our own, and we need to increase our military capabilities as well. So if you translate it, you end up in needing more money, right? So and for that is basically the simple symbol 2%, but in the overall discussion it's better to have the focus on the capabilities. I agree with that.
So picking up on that, the capability and the assertiveness both of Germany and of Europe, a fellow Green parliamentarian, Jürgen Trittin, together with a former Bundestag member, Friedbert Pflüger, recently had an article in Der Spiegel urging that both Germany and the EU be more assertive in general, but specifically in their policy vis-a-vis the US. And one of our reviewers states that they wrote that Germany should no longer accept the erpresserische Wirtschaftspolitik, or economic blackmail, of the Trump administration. After watching the conventions, do you agree with this assessment by Trittin and Pflüger? And maybe Alex, do you want to take a first stab at that, and then anybody else?
Well, it's not after the convention that I agree on the fact that we have to really find something to be more resilient when it comes to those kind of threats from our partners from the United States, like we just experienced them when we talk about secondary sanctions, exterritorial sanctions, and those kind of things. I mean, it's not the first time. We had already, of course, even with partners and friends, there is discussions once in a while, and we have different opinions on many things. Probably it started when we were talking about the Iran deal, and yes, the European side said it's better to have a deal than to have a bad deal than to have no deal at all. Well, you know, Trump had a different view on it, and suddenly we were faced with this, with the secondary sanctions for German companies still trading or dealing with the Iran. this seemed to have worked because suddenly we have the same issue again talking about Nord Stream 2. And up to now, Europe is not resilient enough. We don't have possibilities to protect ourselves and our economy from this kind of behavior. And of course, this doesn't help the transatlantic relations at all. And it is very harmful for the economy in any way. So it's got nothing really to do with the Republican convention. I think the problem might be even deeper, because even if Joe Biden gets elected, even if, and I strongly believe that he has an interest in getting, in repairing the transatlantic relations in some sense, but still, there will be many challenges in the future. And I think there was another viewer questioning about China and Russia, etc. So even if we talk about business and if we talk about economy, for us in Germany, it is virtually not possible to choose between America and China. We need both. Our biggest trade partner by volume is China. Our most important export market is the United States, and the most German companies outside of the European Union, etc., are obviously still in the United States. So it's not possible for us to choose either or. And I believe Trump, but probably even Biden, both will try to push us into this trap, deciding whether we stand along with the United States against China, or if we stand with China against the United States. But that's not the way we want to have our foreign policies. That's not the way we understand diplomacy. We need both, and we need to negotiate with both. We need to discuss issues with both. Of course, we stand with the United States when it comes to the question of Hong Kong, of the Uyghur issue, of the subsidiaries, state subsidiaries in China, and unfair trade. Of course, we stand with the United States, but we also stand with China when it comes to the issue of multilateral organizations such as the WTO. So it's not as easy to decide either or. And I think this is a trap that is really, that might really come up no matter who's winning the upcoming elections. And as partners and friends and allies, we really have to discuss this on a diplomatic way, and not with secondary sanctions, threatening each other, or even hitting hard on each other, which we have experienced over the last at least 2.5 years, or actually 3 years, which I think is not the way to address partners.
But seriously, I'm like on this one, I think, you know, in Germany, we often still do underestimate the current Chinese leadership. And I think we have to come more to terms. And I still find it incredible that Germany is still also betting on Huawei when it comes to 5G, instead of using the European leaders we have, like Nokia, Ericsson. And I think, you know, on that one, I think we shouldn't go into an all war with China. That would be stupid. It still must be a partner in some spheres, climate change, etc., solving crisis, but it's a systemic rival. And the US, I would never define as a systemic rival. That's something for me completely different. So I think, you know, there we rather have to work out how we manage to do it in a way that doesn't risk multilateralism, etc. But I think, you know, we as Germans have to move to a more realistic understanding of China, and to come to a real strategic thinking about China, which is not just determined by our car industry, sorry to say, but I think that there we also have to move. And if I may say, on the economic Erpressung, or, you know, blackmailing, we as Europeans, we have, if we want to have a more independent foreign policy, let's say on Iran, what we need is a euro, our currency, that is a world currency. So far it is not. And if we want this to happen, the FDP, for example, the Free Democratic Party, has to make a lot of shifts in terms of its financial, etc. policy. If you want to have a world currency, you need to be a lender of last resort, which the euro so far is not. So I think we can continue complaining as Europeans, but then we have to adapt our policies and make the euro a real world currency. If we don't, let's stop complaining about American policy seriously, and then don't complain about Trump. If we're not ready to take the steps necessary, let's stop it. I'm like, you know, it's our own choice. And what I do really not like in Europe these days is that we do criticize Trump, and do criticize it for secondary sanctions, and do criticize it for taking our companies hostage, etc. But we do nothing against it. And we could. It's up to us. And as long as we don't do it, we should stop complaining.
So Franziska, let me push you and Alex and Thomas and Nils, if he comes back on that just a little bit. From my reading of the atmosphere of the Stimmung in Germany, it seems as if most Germans want Biden to win the election. And certainly in our conversation, it seems as if all of you would like to see Biden win the election. And I'd like to have some specific reasons as to why. Is it solely because of the style, right? Der Ton macht die Musik, and we all know that there have been some atmospheric disturbances between Washington and Berlin? Or is it because of the tough stance that Trump has taken on Germany on a number of issues, and perhaps a hope that in a Biden administration that tough stance would disappear? Do you think that there might be a different approach in terms of concrete opportunities to improve the German-American relationship moving forward? Does anybody want to take that on?
I think it's both. It's the style, but also the positions and what I mean. We are absolutely aware that we won't go back 10 years ago, and that many of the directions taken by the current administration were already started before the current term, even under Obama. Even if he was very popular in Europe and in Germany, but the directions taken were already at that time in many ways. So it's something we have to be aware of. Maybe one more sentence. I agree to Franziska that we need strategic clarity against China or with regards to China, and can have at the same time trade relations. But I think this is also something where we would like to see a better cooperation with the US, because if we consider China as a strategic rival for the West, then we would be stronger together and not basically each other fighting on its own against China in the many topics we have with them. But at the end, really the style is the primary topic, because we may have different opinions. We may have a different opinion on Nord Stream and on other topics, but we need to discuss and act in a partnership way, in high level, and not in the way it happens now. So, I mean, the secondary sanctions on Nord Stream is really ridiculous, and that's not how you treat an ally, I have to say.
You know, I'm all against Nord Stream 2. I seriously do. And I think if there's one person who managed to keep it alive, it's Trump. It was the least, useful, because as soon as Trump went against it, the German sort of part of it rallied behind it and needed to defend it, which was really counterproductive. I've been opposing it for, foreign policy reasons, for economic reasons, for energy reasons, for environmental reasons, for many things, but it really didn't help in a German debate to have Trump going against it. And talking about his own shale gas, etc. It didn't help. But I think on Trump, it's the style for sure. And foreign policy by Twitter is sort of, difficult. But I really also think it's on the substance. I really think, destroying more or less WHO, going out of WTO, going out of many of the United Nations fora, it's not good for this planet. And it's not good for Americans, nor for Germans or, or French or whoever citizens. So I think it's as much on substance as on style. And I think, why are we looking forward for Biden? I think it's because we know we would go back to some disagreements and hope to work on them, but that we could formulate some positive joint agenda. And I don't see anything where we could have a joint agenda with Trump. We could have with Biden, let's be an ambitious climate change transatlantic new program. Ursula von der Leyen has made the Green Deal her flagship program for her 5 years. Let's do a transatlantic Green Deal flagship together. We could work on on making digital safe and making sure we don't have Russian or Chinese interference. I couldn't see many positive joint agendas that are not, green or social democrat or conservative, but just very European, to be defined together with Biden. I don't see that with Trump.
So Alex and Nils, following on
what Franziska said in the beginning with with Nord Stream, and it's counterproductive that Trump put on this secondary sanctions. This is also true for the 2%, right? We are aware that we need to do more, but now saying or now all this pressure coming from the US, or especially from the president, it's counterproductive. So it doesn't really help in that discussion.
So Alex and Nils, building on what Thomas and Franziska have just talked about, what do you see as the top priorities for the US-European relationship under a Biden administration? And would those priorities continue to exist if Trump were to win re-election?
Well, I partly agree also with Franziska, what she said. It's not only the style. I think one thing that is also important, taking into account why probably Europeans would much prefer Biden to be the president, the upcoming president of the United States, is also the media and the way that we report about the United States and the campaigning, etc. But after all, if you look at the content of the parties, then obviously the Democratic Party is much more aligned with the European idea. If we talk in such a negative connotation about socialism, for example, on the Republican side, I mean, even the most right-wing party in Germany would probably even still be considered to be a left-wing party in the United States. It's just a completely different idea of general how a society should kind of or what the role of the state is and what the role of the society is. And of course, if we look at Biden's campaign or Biden's ideas, they're much more aligned with Europe, talking about the healthcare, social healthcare, talking about weapons, having weapons at home, etc. So for Europeans, this is very, and I'm not only talking about Germany, it's very disturbing and almost very difficult to understand how this constitutional right to have your own arms at home, and still you have like a lot of incidents also over the last few years with Trump being the president, but even before, shootings and things happening. So it's kind of disturbing for us, and it's much easier to adapt with the ideas of the Democrats for Europeans than it is to adapt with the ideas of Republicans for Europeans. I think this is also a main reason why most Europeans would prefer to see Biden in office rather than Trump.
Nils, do you have anything to add? I know you've been in and out a little bit.
Yeah, so the first thing is to check the sound. Otherwise, I rather stop the talking, you know.
Yeah,
Do we get it? No.
We can't really hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, make any sense.
So digital infrastructure fixed wherever you are in Baden-Württemberg at the moment.
Yeah.
But let me maybe, as we start to come to the close, turn a little bit to German politics. Obviously, the next 12 months will be very important in German politics, with the election in the Bundestag in the fall of 2021. And none of us know exactly how long we'll be dealing with the pandemic. So after watching these two largely virtual conventions, is there anything that you've learned that might be applicable to the Parteitage or party conventions in Germany in the run-up to the Bundestag election next year? I think for Franziska, it's probably that social distancing and mask wearing needs to be maintained if one's having in-person events.
I really believe so. And we're having many debates internally how we can have our party convention, which is due end of November. I know the same is happening with the Conservative Party.
Parties.
Parties. I think it's really, seriously not easy to say, but I think that the Democrats did, it's not the same as if you're in live in a person, but that they did a good job in making it still interesting, even though it was only digital. And so in that sense, we can learn from it. And I'm, at least in Germany, I think if any party of us would hold a convention with 2,000 people packed without any distancing, no chance. I don't think it's, I don't know. I can't imagine that, either the Liberal Party or the Conservative or us would do that. We would get so much negative press, and people would demonstrate against us immediately. AfD might, yes, they're not respecting the AfD, by the way, the far right-wing party, is the only one whose members in the plenary often do not respect the social distancing rules, even if the president of the Bundestag called upon them and said, please do respect and don't stand together, etc. They don't respect it. So that could be, I don't know, but at least in the Bundestag so far, they have not been really respectful of the corona rules. But if there was one question on political correctness, which came up, yes. I think watching the Republican,
Let me just read the question so that everybody knows, because this is an interesting viewer question that came in. Germany and the United States are facing a similar situation in which political correctness is increasingly becoming a factor on which people vote. Do you share the Republicans and Trump's concern that freedom of speech in our respective societies is being limited by forces of political correctness in the media, in academia, in corporate and elite cultures, etc.? How does the fear that people are losing the courage to speak their honest opinion openly resonate in a country like Germany? So Franziska, just so that everybody knew the question.
For me, watching the Republican convention just shows that there is no such thing as political correctness, because there were so many things said, so many lies, which I think, are not useful for a society that sticks together, but that are rather divisive and splitting our societies apart. And I really fundamentally believe that of course, language is power, and we have to be careful about how we use our language. But that there is enough room in our societies, in yours, to address the ills and the problems that we do face. Like, none of us is always saying everything is rosy and wonderful. But yeah, it's a very strong discourse that we have in Germany, the saying we can't say what we want to say and then say it without any, problem, but rather increasing. And that's a very old tactique. Like, if you study the Nazis and how they came up in power, they used exactly the same. It's a very powerful, successful strategy tactique. And there were interesting books from the 50s that analyze it. And if you take this analysis now of the speech and how they use it, you can apply it to today's far right-wing and populist movements. It's exactly the same. So I think, let's be careful of not buying into tactiques that would like to get to a different kind of regime, which is not democratic nor liberal.
Thomas and Alex, any thoughts on the impact of political correctness, or about lessons learned after watching these two conventions?
Well, I don't completely disagree with Trump's thesis on not Trump's thesis in general, on the thesis of political correctness. Obviously, political behavior has changed over the last decade. That's definitely, and that's just normal, and that's just okay. But if you look at them, for example, I sometimes have fun watching Strauss and the CSU Prime Minister on the YouTube videos. Just imagine one of us would behave the way he did in his times, standing up a stage and kind of insulting the viewers. No chance. Nowadays, you would get kicked out of the room. It's really, but still, this guy had a lot of charisma, and he was moving the crowds, and he was moving the people. It's true at some point that, especially when it comes to the media, there is a few topics, even for us as politicians, where it's very difficult to openly talk about, because there is some taboo kind of things. And this is also, there's a very strong mainstream in Germany, and if you have a different opinion, it's very difficult to address it. And there is some truth to it, and I think we really have to pay attention as a democracy, and we really have to pay attention on how far we will accept also other opinions that are probably not aligned with my own ideas, but we still want to protect the freedom of these kind of opinions. So there is a problem with political correctness. If political correctness gets so far that you at some point have an issue, I mean, we have the discussions in my family, etc., that you have an issue expressing yourself the way you want to. I do agree at some point that there is a movement that I would rather have back the political correctness to say 20 years ago than the political correctness we accept as political correctness today. because I think people 20 years ago were more able to openly speak also as parliamentarians, also politically stating their views than they are today.
You know what, as a woman, I'm very happy that I'm not in the times of Strauss, the way he talked to women, to parliamentarians. And I'm very happy that this has changed. I'm very happy that we speak differently about mothers, single mothers in Germany today than we spoke a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure if I had entered politics, if it was still the same language towards women, single mothers, etc., than it was back then. And I think that's a very, excludes a lot of people who don't want to come in, and we should not really mix up political correctness with a fair exchange of ideas on very diverse, backgrounds. I come from a conservative family. My father was with the CDU, and I would say on the right side of the CDU. And I can tell you that I have had many very tough debates with him, but always in respect and in a fair manner. And that's something that I think we should aim for, that we need to do in the Bundestag, and not going back to the old times. And that's a new challenge for us, to make these fights interesting, challenging, but respectful. And I think if we as Democrats don't manage to do this, yes, we will all together lose out. But it's not about, is there a problem of what you can say? I think you can say a lot in Germany, and I will always fight for it.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. I mean, there are certain topics which we need to be really sensitive in a way that we really also accept different opinions. I agree with that. But the narrative that there are a lot of things you can't say is not true. And there was this fun situation where, at a discussion with our chancellor, there was this one man basically taking the microphone and just complaining about that, and Angela Merkel was basically responding that, well, by asking this question you could express yourself, and nobody did say anything about it. So it's absolutely or obviously not true that people are limited in what they say, but of course it's the question on respect against others and the way how you find your words.
Well, we've spent an hour together. The time has gone by incredibly quickly, and we've touched on a lot of topics, and there are undoubtedly a lot of topics that we should continue to talk about. And I think this last point about talking about political correctness in politics could be the subject of a future webinar or discussion, because it's certainly one that stirs a lot of emotion on both sides of the Atlantic and is of incredible importance. But I want to thank all three of you for making the time on a Friday evening to talk with us. This has been, I think, a fascinating discussion, even though we've just been skimming the surface on many of the issues. And I'd be delighted to have all of you back as your schedules permit to continue this conversation or other conversations. I'd also like to thank our viewers for an incredible number of questions, some of which were folded in the course of our conversation and our discussion, but certainly give fodder for many more discussions like this. We hardly touched on Russia, on China, on some of the big foreign policy issues. And we also did not really get into the fact that even if Trump wins re-election, there's much more to the German-American relationship than just the relationship between the White House and the Bundeskanzleramt, or between Washington and Berlin, and that a lot can happen on subnational levels. So we look forward to staying in contact with all three of you and with Nils Schmid, who unfortunately had to leave a little bit early. But this has been a fascinating conversation, and I wish you all ein schönes Wochenende.
Same to you, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good time. Bye-bye.
Bye.